To the U.S. now, where former President Donald Trump has invoked the Fifth Amendment by refusing to answer questions during a deposition into potential tax fraud at the Trump Organization. Now, the civil probe into the Trump's business practices being conducted by the Attorney General of New York State is unrelated to the execution of a federal search warrant at his Palm Beach, Florida residence, which involves a probe into the removal of classified documents from the White House when he left office. For more on all of these legal probes, we speak to our correspondent in New York, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, a week of high legal and political drama involving the former Republican president who has refused to answer questions put to him by the New York Attorney General as part of his civil investigation into possible tax fraud at the Trump Organization.
Yeah, Bongi, you'll remember that Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York State, in March this year came out with a statement that her office had uncovered significant evidence related to possible tax fraud by the Trump organization. That essentially is the deposition we're talking about that Trump sat for earlier today with the Attorney General here in New York City and refused to answer her questions because, as he says, that is protected by the United States Constitution. In fact, he released a very lengthy statement as it relates to this tax fraud investigation of the Trump organization, saying, "I did nothing wrong," which is why, after 5 years of looking, the federal, state and local governments, together with the fake news media, have found nothing. This is a vindictive and self-serving fishing expedition, the likes of which our country has never seen before. I once asked, if you're innocent, why do you take the fifth, right? He was campaigning in 2016 for the presidency of the United States, where he was casting aspersions on people that take the Fifth Amendment and observe their right, essentially, not to incriminate themselves. He now says that now I know the answer. When your family, your company, and all the people in your orbit have become targets of an unfounded, politically motivated witch hunt, you have no choice but to invoke the Fifth. So that's just one element of the president's legal troubles that he's facing. Of course, you have the ongoing probe by the Justice Department, by the FBI, into his handling of presidential records. And that's what we saw in terms of that FBI executing the search warrant on Monday, quite separate from developments that are proceeding here in New York City.
And Sherwin, just talking about, of course, those very developments at his Palm Beach, Florida residence, which, of course, there's talk of the handling of some classified White House documents that should have been handed over to the National Archives. What are we learning, though, given that the justice system has said very little about this particular investigation and why this dramatic escalation was necessary?
Yeah, the why is really important here, Bongi, because we don't know why, because the Justice Department does not comment on ongoing investigations. That is a rule that is not dependent on which administration is in office. The Justice Department just does not comment in terms of Justice Department policy on ongoing investigations. So we're getting very, very little from them as to why they felt the need for this escalation. We understand it has to do with the Presidential Records Act. Essentially, the government librarian, known as the National Archives, is responsible for storing and keeping all presidential records, whether it's memos, emails, documents, classified information, non-classified information. And the argument here is that Donald Trump left with boxes full, some 15 boxes is the number they use, when he departed the White House in January 2021, and left with some classified materials. There have been ongoing discussions between the National Archives and his team in Mar-a-Lago. Some of those boxes were returned, but the reason for this escalation, we understand, is because not all the classified information that has implications for national security were returned, and that's why you saw this escalation. Some 30 agents searching the Mar-a-Lago estate down in Florida. I spoke to constitutional law expert Professor Penelope Andrews of New York Law School, really trying to understand the Presidential Records Act, and this is what she said. Watch.
The Presidential Record Act essentially requires that the records of the president, all the records that pertain to the duty of the president, has to be preserved, has to be protected. Now, I do think that in this case, there is a great fear about two things. First, that the presidential records and the documents were going to be destroyed. And in fact, the great fear that some were already destroyed. So yesterday, for example, in the newspaper, we saw some photographs of former President Trump destroying documents by throwing them down the toilet. So I think that's the first thing, that the Presidential Records Act is clear that those documents have to be preserved, protected, and be sent to the National Archives, where they will be stored, and obviously they are records for public consumption. But the second thing is that I think that some of the documents, some of the records are very, very high security classified documents. And in fact, the media seems to be suggesting here in the United States that some of those documents are so high security, so classified that you couldn't even name them or describe them, because that in itself would be a breach of national security.
And of course, there is a political dynamic here, right? The Republicans are furious that this has played out the way it has, and they are demanding answers from the Justice Department as to why they believe this level of escalation, given the fact that the president's team was already talking to the National Archives, was already engaged with the FBI, why they felt they needed to act in this way, and of course, creating ructions across the country, Bongi.
And Sherwin, all of this is happening against, growing concerns. I mean, when one looks at our own experience here in South Africa, for example, you look at the potential violence that could erupt, particularly given what happened last year during the unrest after former President Jacob Zuma was imprisoned. Given the very broad support, though, that Trump still enjoys within the Republican Party and around the country, how much of a concern is potential violence if, say, the former president is indicted?
It's a huge concern, and let January 6th, 2021 be our guide, right? The attack on the Capitol, the insurrection on the Capitol that sought to prevent the peaceful transfer of power from former President Trump to incumbent Joe Biden. That is the most recent example of what could happen here. There are also, we understand, mutterings on social media, particularly from right-wing groups, that they are locked and loaded in terms of wanting to defend the patriot former President Donald Trump. And of course, the narrative here is, to a large extent, Bongi, being dominated by former President Trump. He's the one that is releasing statements about the raid. This is not coming from the Justice Department. He calls it a raid. It was a search warrant, of course, and you can already see we use raid more than we do search warrant, given that he was the first to reveal details of that. It's also something I raised with Professor Penelope Andrews. This is what she said.
The comparisons I draw is, the first is the threat by Kevin McCarthy, the leader of the Republicans in the House, sort of suggesting that this is politically motivated, and an insidious threat by supporters of the former president that the FBI is sort of a wing of the Democratic Party. So there's a threat that people are going to go out onto the streets. Something like the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. And I see that with respect to the violence in South Africa in July, particularly the violence in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, and the fact that the supporters of the president went out and created havoc when, former President Zuma was imprisoned. I do think, though, that in this country, the country is on notice that this may happen. So they would probably take preventive or prophylactic measures to ensure that this does not happen. Whereas in South Africa, once it happened, the security force and the police and subsequently the courts have had to step in. So I think that the prevention of violence is something that needs to, obviously be secured here.
And Bongi, we refer to this as uncharted waters, unprecedented that a former president's residence, private residence, would be invaded in a sense by the FBI, and certainly uncharted waters in what the reaction might be if the former president is in fact indicted. We're a long way from that, and of course pressure on the Justice Department to come clean as to why they felt this escalation was indeed necessary.
A long way, Sherwin, but I think you're still going to get more statements because knowing Trump, he's not going to stop talking. But thank you so much for your time this evening. That was Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News correspondent in New York.